Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's live edition of New Hope Radio. Glad to have everybody on board with us today. Got a special program, so I'm glad that you tuned in because we got some real hot topics to talk about today, and I got some help in the studio. Pastor Dave Aucoin from Abundant Life, Swansea. Right, Dave? Swansea, Mass?
Glad to be here, Dave.
We're like neighbors, aren't we?
We are. We're only a few miles away.
Two churches in the same town. So we're glad to have you join us today, and we're going to talk about what's called an Engage Your Community curriculum.
We are. It's pretty exciting.
And so thank you for joining us today. Listen, you might be listening to us on 1590 WARV AM dial. That's good. Thank you for that. Maybe you're listening on newhopecc.tv. Click Facebook. That's a good one, too. And WARV.net. So we're coming at you three different ways today, and we're happy to have you on board as we talk about this curriculum, because we're going to begin the series tonight. And Dave, you're going to open up the series tonight.
Yes, I am. We're going to talk a little bit about something special called Lobby Day for Massachusetts, but then we're going to dive right into our curriculum. And like you said, a lot of these topics are hot topics. There are things that are taking place in our culture and in our society, and we're going to talk about them, see how we can compare them with our Christian faith.
And these topics, I mean, we deal with them every day, and I'm going to show our watchers on Facebook what the book looks like. Here it is, Engage. And Dave, where can they, if someone wants to order this book just for their own reading, where can they get that?
Well, they can go to the website for Mass Family Institute. You can Google Mass Family Institute, or it's mafamily.org, and you can order it there.
All right, so let's get right into our topic. Why do we need a curriculum like this? Why do we need a series on the topics that are in this book?
Well, you know, Dave, these are very complicated issues. They deal with people, and we always want to be empathetic with people where they're at. Much of what we're talking about today, it really relates to the brokenness that people experience in a lot of different ways. So by us being articulate and talking about them, it really helps us to relate to family members, to neighbors, to people in our communities that might be struggling in these areas or having been affected by them.
And some of the topics that we do have in this book, I mean, I'll tell you what, they're things that, especially as a Christian community, we really have to make a stand against some of these things.
Yeah.
And abortion is always in the news, assisted suicide, euthanasia, sex education for children. I mean, where do we start how do we start addressing these things?
Well, the first two chapters of the book have to do with the separation of church and state. And there are a lot of misconceptions about that. I bet people think it's even in the Constitution, that it's in our Constitution that there is a separation of church and state, and that's not the case. You'll hear more about that tonight and next week as well. You know, the church was never meant to be controlled by the government, but the church was meant by our founding fathers to be an influence on the government and an influence on our laws. So a very interesting topic that kind of starts us off with it, and we get into these other areas.
And this is going to be a 9-week series starting tonight right here at New Hope on Route 6 in Swansea, Mass. And Dave, you're going to kick it off for us and teach some of the sessions, maybe all of them if I can get you to. And I appreciate it, because you've done this in your church, haven't you?
I did. Dave, we had about 20 people take this whole course in our church, and everyone, to a man and woman, said, we did not know a lot of this stuff, and people need to know about this, especially in our churches. And if they knew about these things, things would be a lot different.
So let's talk about some of these topics, because again, these are things you wonder sometimes as you see these things happening in the news, if we really have any voice at all. How can we stop the public schools from teaching gender identity to 5- and 6-year-olds? How do we do that?
Well, we are a representative government. We elect our leaders, and if we would be careful and cautious in electing leaders with the same moral values as we have, then the laws coming out of our legislature would be different. And I think what we've found is that the non-Christian community, special identity politics have kind of taken over government and have kind of pass legislation that reflects their moral values. So in a way, and I can say this in a kind way, we are to blame for the laws that are coming out of the State House because we elected those officials. And most of the time we elected them without knowing where they really stood.
I think there's a segment of Christianity that feels, the church shouldn't be involved in the political process. And maybe that's why we kind of drop the ball and these things slip by. But the church should be involved in the political process.
Dave, I met with a group of business people last month, and they expressed that same consternation. Should we be involved in these things? But you know what one of the reasons was they gave for that? For us in Rhode Island, Rhode Island politics are complicated. They are a challenge to see their ethics involved in a lot of situations. So the general opinion is, let's just keep our hands off. It's too messy to get into. But hey, if you've got a messy garage or a messy basement or a messy attic, you can push it off as long as you want. Eventually, you're going to have to get it in order.
Well, we can even lay Christianity aside, and if you have godly morals and godly ethics, as a citizen, you have a voice, and you can still stand up and be involved in the process. Maybe not as a Christian, but just as a citizen that believes differently and has different convictions.
But Dave, most of that's going to come about by having a knowledge of the laws that are being made, that they're even being made in the first place. For instance, last year in Rhode Island, it was made illegal for any licensed professional medical person or counselor to counsel a minor away from the homosexual transgender lifestyle. It is now illegal in Rhode Island to counsel them away. According to the way the law is written, all we can do is affirm their sense of direction in going in that way. Now, does that give us, is that religious freedom, Dave?
I wonder if the parent would be stopped from counseling their own child.
Yes, there are a number of instances across the country where it's actually, I believe Andrew Beckwith in his material says in Massachusetts they actually label it as child abuse if you do not validate a minor's intention to go in that lifestyle. If you don't validate, it's considered child abuse, and children are actually being removed from parents' homes as a result. Now that's a violation of our First Amendment rights. It really is.
What has happened to the morality of this country? How did it make a 180-degree turn over the last generation? What do you think happened?
Well, see, now that gets into our first chapter tonight. We're actually going to look at the scriptures about that. Book of Romans, chapter 1, gives us a pretty good indication that when we don't acknowledge God, He gives us over to what the Bible says is a reprobate mind. He gives us over to the ungodly principles, what life is like without God. Let me give you an example. We took prayer out of the schools in 1973. What kind of a decision was that? Have we seen the schools better for it? I think not. I think Florida last week just showed us that the schools could use God back in the schools. In Rhode Island and I believe other places, they have removed the Ten Commandments from the walls or any pictures of the Ten Commandments. Well, what do some of the commandments say? Thou shalt not kill. So we've removed a lot of the checks and balance, the moral checks and balance, out of the public view, out of our young people's views. And you know what? Adults need to recapture those moral values and stand for them, because really kids do value what adults think. They value what their parents think and what other adults over them think. So if we don't take a stand and actually teach these and try to influence the next generation, they're gonna find their own way. And water that isn't running and moving is always stagnant, and that's what's kind of happening in our culture.
Thinking about the Ten Commandments, I'm like, what's wrong with the Ten Commandments? What's wrong with telling people you shouldn't lie, you shouldn't steal, you shouldn't murder? I mean, to me, those things make sense. So why would you take them off the wall when apparently those are the morals that we're trying to instill in people.
Yeah. I can remember growing up in school seeing those commandments. And, I'd break them at different times, but they were always there as the standard. This is the way we should be living, and this is the kind of life that God will bless. We can stray and we can take our life into our own hands, and usually when the pain gets too much to bear, we kind of come back to what we know is right. But you're right, we create a real hardship for our kids by not influencing them in the first place.
I've got the book in front of me, Dave. As a matter of fact, this is the curriculum we'll be using. The series does begin tonight here at New Hope. Engage the Bay State, which is really geared for a movement in Massachusetts, but I know you're trying to get something started in Rhode Island also.
Yes, we are, yes. We're trying to start a family policy council in Rhode Island, just like Mass Family Institute is in Massachusetts. And Mass Family Institute has been a great help to us and influence to us. I've been following them for a number of years. Would you mind if I just back up a little bit to 2016? 2016, in Massachusetts, there was a law passed called the Bathroom Bill. And that law actually said, and it included churches, that they are public places. And if a man, a transgender man, would come into our church, and my church is right on a line in Massachusetts, and he wanted to use the girls' room, I could not stop him. And the result of stopping him, for anybody stopping him, the pastor could be fined anywhere from $2,500 to $50,000, and he could spend 30 days to a year in jail. That's how the law read at the Attorney General's website. And Alliance Defending Freedom, Mass Family Institute, Alliance Defending Freedom helped us to challenge that law, and they exempted churches from that. Dave, all I could picture was a guy walking into our ladies' room, our multi-stall ladies' room, with 6- and 7-year-old girls that I knew would be in there. It just wasn't going to happen, and fortunately we were able to change that.
So let's get practical now. What was it that was done to change that law? Obviously some people had to do something.
Well, there are Christian lawyers, and ADF, Alliance Defending Freedom, is a international group of Christian lawyers. They did this pro bono. They just enlisted us. And they helped us through this process. But you don't have to get to a place where these things are imposed upon us. We can elect and let our voting officials know that we don't want these kind of laws. And that's what Lobby Day is actually about. Last year, Dave, I went to Lobby Day on Beacon Hill, and there were 200, mostly church congregation people. There was 200. We were actually greeted by a number of legislators who are Christians who said, we need you to encourage us and to back us as we fight some of these laws. And it was very peaceful. It was so well done. We met. We had a folder with where we stood on a number of things. They told us who our representative officials were, and then they dispatched us to bring those folders to them to let them know this is where we stand. It makes a difference. Recently in Rhode Island, we met with the Department of Education, who are pushing the transgender mandate on Rhode Island schools. And they were going to, I think it was last Wednesday, they were going to mandate that all school districts in Rhode Island have a transgender policy, and the one they were putting forward was not a good one. And we had enough calls and emails in that they actually tabled that, and it died in a sense. So yes, it does make a difference when you call or email your representatives and your senators.
Let's talk a little bit about that Lobby Day. What's the date? Where's it taking place, and what can people in Massachusetts do?
It's March 19th. If you would like to go, it's at Beacon Hill. It's at the State House from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. And we're trying to organize some buses to go up there. There's one bus that will be leaving right from Brockton, just off the highway in Brockton, and a number of other different sites in Massachusetts. That's probably the one closest to us. But this year, this has grown each year, so this year I think there are going to be more than 200. I'm hoping for 300 people that will just gather together for this Lobby Day. It would be a real statement of our Christian faith and what we want to see for laws coming out of the State House.
If somebody wants to participate in Lobby Day and maybe get on the bus, Where do they go for information on how to do that?
They can go on the Mass Family Institute website. They could call. They could call me, my church, and leave a message, and I can try to hook them up with information. The number for our church is 508-379-0780. That's 508-379-0780.
And they can find you online too?
Yes, at abundantlifeswansea.com is our website.
Okay, so there's plenty of information. And I think, like you say, I didn't realize that politicians really listen to their people. I didn't think we really had much of a chance with that.
They do. I think those are certain politicians who share our moral values, whether they're Christian or not. They share the same moral values that we do. But then again, Dave, there are those who don't. And let me tell you this, if you keep your head in the sand, they will sneak things under the wire. Some of the, we're going to talk about abortion on week number 3. And Dave, right now, I know, I've seen it, the legislation that's coming out of the Rhode Island State House, there's about 4 bills that call for abortion on demand right up until the time of birth. So now you're talking partial birth abortion. And you know what? If nobody says anything, those bills will pass.
Right.
There's not going to be a lot of hoopla. And you know who will suffer? Women will suffer, men will suffer, and especially those babies will suffer.
And what happens? We can get dull, numb to all of this.
Yep.
You know, I think we're becoming numb to violence.
Yes.
And we can become numb to homosexuality.
Yes.
We can become numb or dull to abortion. And pretty soon it's going to be euthanasia and assisted suicide. And before you know it, all of these evil things are just going to be an accepted way of life. And like you said, we just stood by and let it happen.
You know how I keep that from happening in my own life? And this is just for me. But I think about grace, Dave. And you and I have talked about grace a number of times. We didn't deserve Christ's salvation. But when I think of how God met me when I was away from Him, it makes me realize again and again that no matter how far somebody goes away from God, He's always reaching out. The love of Christ is always reaching out for them. So, Dave, our goal is not really political, it's spiritual. This is a spiritual goal to reach out and draw people to Christ. There's a lot of brokenness, and Christ has the answer. He came to make people whole.
Right. So I'm going to run down some of these topics, Dave. The first 2 weeks of the series, starting tonight, church and state.
Yes.
Give us a little summary of what that's about.
Well, again, that separation of church and state is not in the Constitution. It was actually a protection. Thomas Jefferson was talking to some Baptists in Connecticut, and he was letting them know they were worried about the church, the state intervening, the government intervening in church life. And so he talked to them about there being a separation of church and state. So it was the reverse of what people are making it out to be today. We're also going to talk about the reason that we do need to have moral laws. You mentioned before, can morality be legislated? Well, all laws have a certain morality attached to them. If you're in some countries, it is perfectly legal to execute anyone who's against the government. That's the law. And you can throw them in prison. They can be sent away to prison camps. But in America, there is religious freedom. There is freedom of speech. So these laws are important. Also, we can see, as we mentioned a little earlier, that it's hard to articulate these things. And in a class like this, you have a chance to discuss them and hear how to discuss them in a healthy way with your neighbors, with your friends, with your family, people at work. We're going to see some laws, that some things that were done legally, kind of bending the law a certain way. We're going to see how there's been abuse of our religious freedom. We're going to talk about how laws are made, what the legislative body in Massachusetts or any state is actually comprised of, the House of Representatives and the Senate. We're going to look at how laws are appealed and how they work their way up to the Supreme Court. And again, we're going to talk about the brokenness in people's lives, and that's a lot of what we're trying to help avoid is brokenness in people. Like good laws keep people safe, and there's always going to be brokenness. There's always going to be some that are hurt. But I'll tell you something, with our laws are fundamentally Christian in their nature, and that promotes a healthier community, a healthier culture. And let me say this, Dave, too, is that the family unit is the basic unit of our culture. And the weakening of the family weakens the whole culture. So our whole goal, Mass Family Institute is associated with Focus on a Family. These are part of Focus on a Family, network part of it. Same thing that we're trying to do in Rhode Island is linked with Focus on a Family. Hey, you don't have to be listening to the radio long or reading books relative to Focus on a Family to know that they build up families. And that's what we want to do. And that'll be part of our discussion tonight.
So the first 2 weeks are going to be on the church and state.
Yes.
And then the third week will be about abortion.
Yes.
What are some of the things we'll cover with that?
Well, some of our laws, you'd be surprised at how far the abortion laws have gone. We're going to look at Planned Parenthood. If ever there was somebody who branded themselves differently than they actually function, it's Planned Parenthood. You almost get the idea by the name that they're for the family. They're not for the family.
Literally, they do plan.
Oh, they plan, all right.
Murder.
Yes,
They do.
yes.
And then the week after that, and I can see the slippery slope on this one, how assisted suicide can then slip into euthanasia.
Oh, yes. You know, a couple of things there, Dave. It is a challenge when people find out that they have cancer and going through chemotherapy. And there are a lot of decisions that person have to make. In my congregation, a year ago, January, this woman that we had ministry to went to be with the Lord, and she knew the year before that she had cancer, and she knew it was inoperable. And she asked the doctor, she said, what is my life going to be like if I go through chemo for the next year? After he described it to her, he said, I want to spend this last year of my life with my 3 daughters as best as I can with the best quality of health. So she chose not to have chemo. That's somebody who knew what they were doing, and there was good reason. Some people are so full of fear that they're so afraid of dying that they make wrong decisions. And family members need to hear some of this information so that they can help them along. I pastored in upstate New York, it was up in the boonies, and it was great. But there was an adult home, a daycare home, with 8 senior citizens in it. And these 2 nurses that had retired from New York were taking care of them. And they would tell me stories of family members, grandchildren, nephew, even kids, who would empty their checkbooks of those seniors, take advantage of them because they were either ill, senile, or just not well. And there's a lot of that we don't realize, that when people are in a situation where they're elderly, where they're physically impaired, they can be victimized so easily by others. Euthanasia, you start making euthanasia legal, and you're going to see a lot of people and they can make that decision for somebody else without them even realizing what they're doing. And so there's a lot there in that bill.
That's the epitome of abuse. Not taking someone's stuff, taking their life.
Seniors today are victimized by a lot. We don't want to be doing that. We don't want to be a part of that.
And then, of course, the 5th week, we talked about it a bit already, sex education. And what really bothers me about that is, starting in kindergarten.
Yes.
First grade. I mean, come on. Children are too innocent to even be exposed to anything like that.
Yes.
But the liberal curriculum they know what they're doing. It's in Canada, it's in California, and we know it's going to come out to the East Coast.
Yes.
And they're indoctrinating these little 5- and 6-year-olds.
You know what's scary too, Dave, is that these laws. There was some recently in Rhode Island that would have imposed this upon parochial schools and private schools, and religious schools and churches. It would have been imposed upon them. And fortunately, that mandate was stopped. But there will be more. It'll get repackaged and come again. The other thing, Dave, last year when I was up on Beacon Hill, I went to a special meeting up on Beacon Hill because Planned Parenthood had put forward a curriculum for the public schools in Massachusetts. Planned Parenthood. And I got a glimpse of what some of those chapters were, and I want to tell you, I would just say perversion in capital letters. Perversion in capital letters. Stuff that parents would be appalled. But, again, without you realizing it, these things can be slipped into the public school system and curriculum without you even realizing it.
Dave, we got about 2 minutes left in the program. That went by quickly.
Yes.
Give everyone that's in the local area an invitation to come out tonight, and why they would benefit from coming out to the class tonight.
Well, in my church, when we talked about this, a lot of people said, boy, you can tell the Lord's coming back soon. And I think, Dave, you and I and some of the pastors that we meet with have said that. You can see the signs of the times. There has been more change, negative change in our culture in the last 5 years than probably in the last 50 or 60 years put together. And I look at it this way. I think it's a challenge. The darkness seems to be getting darker, but my Bible says that Jesus came to destroy the works of the devil. And he also said he was going to build this church, and the gates of hell would not prevail against it. So what that tells me is that we have our marching orders as a church to be salt and to be light. We need to know what we believe. We need to know how to articulate our faith. You don't have to be a theologian to defend your moral stance with Christianity. God created us, mind, body, and soul. He knows what works best for us. Come on out. Hear these things. Get a chance to discuss them. And I'll tell you, you'll be enlightened, I think. And it will help you to grow in your faith and how to be able to articulate your faith.
Pastor Dave Aucoin, Abundant Life, thank you for joining us today. Great program, and looking forward to a real good time tonight studying the Engage Your Community curriculum. Thanks for coming, Dave.
Thank you, Dave. I enjoy your friendship. Thank you.
Thank you. Hey, everybody, thank you for coming along. Listen, come on out tonight, 7 o'clock at New Hope, Route 6 in Swansea. It's the beginning of a 9-week series. You'll really be glad that you did, okay? Thanks for listening today. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time for more of New Hope Radio.